one.
Drahí priatelia, drahé priateľky, čitateľky a čitatelia a hlavne všetci fanúšikovia dobrej literatúry, verím, že nás sledujete a budete nás sledovať počas najbližšej hodiny. Moje meno je Samom Marec a dnes mám tú veľkú česť, že sa budem túto hodinu rozprávať s Kate Brown. Kate Brown je profesorka na Massachusetts Institute of Technology a okrem toho v rámci svojej špecifikácie, čo je teda jadrová energia a súvisiace veci, napísala niekoľko kníh a kniha, o ktorej sa budeme rozprávať, sa volá Černobyľ, Príručka, prežitia. Je to kniha, ktorú teraz čerstvo vydáva Absint a je to fantastická kniha. Takže o tom sa budeme rozprávať. Ešte pripomeniem, že toto podujatie sa koná s podporou Fondu na podporu umenia a ideme na to. Hello, Kate, what a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you for welcoming me, Samuel. I understand a bit of Slovak from knowing Polish and Russian and Ukrainian, so that was very kind. Thank you for the kind words about my book.
I'm very happy. You might as well correct me, when I translate something out, when I'm not right. No, výborne. Takže Kate rozumie trošku po slovensky, keďže hovorí po polsky. My sme sa predtým, keď sme boli ešte offline, rozprávali aj o Krakove, takže to bude veľmi príjemné, ale ideme rovno na vec. Okay, so my first question is going to be, have you seen the Chernobyl series?
Yes, I have. I saw it when everybody else did when it came out on HBO. And I found it really interesting because the directors kept talking about, this made-for-TV drama was the truth. This was as close to a regime of reality that they could get. And but what I found interesting is that they really duplicated. They used a lot of Soviet photos and stories, and so they reproduced the official Soviet government's narrative about the accident. They said the accident is safely contained inside the Chernobyl zone. They said, we'll make big heroes out of the liquidators, and we'll tell everybody that the chapter is closed, and we'll just say the problem was caused by the scapegoats, which were these nuclear power operators. And so the HBO show sort of reproduces that Soviet propaganda narrative.
Opýtal som sa Kate, či sledovala seriál Černobyl, ktorý verím, že ste videli aj mnohí z vás. Áno, videla som ten seriál a prekvapilo ma, že keďže režiséri hovorili, že je to vlastne najbližšie k realite, ako sa dalo dostať, tak potom do veľkej miery zopakovali ten oficiálny sovietský narratív. Ten oficiálny sovietský narratív je, že glorifikácia tých likvidátorov katastrofy, že mimo tej zóny toho zamorenia je vlastne všetko bezpečné a že teda na vine sú tí, ktorí oficiálne boli tými obetnými baránkami. And so that's not quite true, is it? What they said in the series.
No, I mean, in my book, I figured we all know a lot about the moments ticking up to the accident and then the explosion, what they show in the HBO show. But I wanted to know what happened afterwards. What were the environmental and medical consequences of the accident? And I was surprised there was very little about that other than a big UN report in 2006. We really don't know.
Takže zhodli sme sa teda na tom, že ten televízny seriál nie je celkom presný v týchto veciach, ale Kate sa hlavne zaujímala o tie dopady na životné prostredie a na zdravotný stav ľudí, pretože to je vec, o ktorej sa veľmi nehovorí a veľmi veľa sa o nej nevie, okrem teda nejakej správy Organizácie spojených národov z roku 2006. I know it's a simple question and broad one, but what are the effects then?
Well, so here's what we know officially. UN sources say 33 to 54 people died from the accident. That 300, and this was Moscow said, 300 people were hospitalized after the accident from Chernobyl exposures. And that, 6,000 kids got cancers later, but 10 years. They said that 10 years after the accident. But what I found, I went to the archives and I worked through the Ministry of Health archives of the former Soviet republics, Ukraine, Belarus, Russia. And what I found is that the accident was not contained inside the Chernobyl zone, that the radiation doesn't know the boundaries of a fence, and it went widely all over Europe, but especially around these three republics, that not 300 people were hospitalized, but 40,000 were hospitalized in just the summer after the accident for Chernobyl exposures. 11,000 were children. And that people lived in areas of extremely high levels of radioactivity until the Soviet Union collapsed, and then afterwards. And I can talk a little bit more about that.
Podľa tých oficiálnych údajov, lebo opýtal som sa teda na tie efekty atomového výbuchu v elektrárni, a podľa tých oficiálnych údajov moskovských zomrelo 33 až 54 ľudí, zhruba 300 ľudí bolo hospitalizovaných a asi 6 000 detí potom ochorelo na nejaké formy rakoviny neskôr. Ale Kate prešla archívy ministerstva zdravotníctva v tých sovietských republikách, ktorých sa to týkalo, teda na Ukrajine, v Bielorusku a v Rusku. A zistila, že to teda celkom nie je pravda, že ten mrak sa nešíril len v tej oficiálnej zóne, ale vlastne vo všetkých tých troch republikách, a že len v tom lete po výbuchu bolo hospitalizovaných 40 000 ľudí a z toho 11 000 detí. Takže ten dopad bol oveľa väčší, a okrem toho, až do rozpadu Sovietskeho zväzu a ešte aj potom obrovské množstvo ľudí žilo naozaj v tej zóne toho zamorenia. The funny thing, though, is... Okay, go on.
No, go ahead. I was going to say, well, let me just show you. I'll just share a screen with you, and to show you just, what happened 3 days after the accident, for example. Here's a picture. They had a big storm front. It was emerging from the Chernobyl zone. It was going to have big thunder clouds that were going to rain down radioactive fallout on the big Russian cities of Voronezh, Yaroslavl, and Moscow, harming potentially millions of people. So the Soviet generals sent up planes, and they manipulated the weather so it rained down fallout on rural Belarus in order to save urban Russia. And so you have this image here. This is the Chernobyl zone down in this corner. You see it angry, hot, red spots. The pilots let Gomel, big city, be free, and then they let it rain here in the southern Mogilov province. These areas are as hot, as you can see, as right next to the Chernobyl zone. And these people, nobody told anybody in Belarus that this triage operation had occurred. 200,000 farmers lived down there, and they remained there. It wasn't fully depopulated until 1999.
Jedna z takých vecí, ktorá sa teda stala, a týka sa to tej mapy, ktorú nám Kate ukázala, je, že z tej černobylskej oblasti, tam sa vytvorila búrka, boli tam veľké búrkové mraky, ktoré teda hrozili tým, že ten radioaktívny dážď spadne. A že spadne na 3 veľké mestá v Rusku, na Voronež, na Jaroslavl a na Moskvu. A skutočne teda naozaj vzlietli stíhačky, aby spôsobili, že ten dážď spadne inde a spadne skôr, a konkrétne na vidieku v Bielorusku a potom v oblasti Mogileva, to je také mesto v Bielorusku. A to aj napriek tomu, že naozaj nikto v Bielorusku nevedel, že niečo také sa deje. A vlastne zasiahlo to oblasť, v ktorej žilo až 200 000 farmárov, ktorí sa živili z tej pôdy. A žili tam vlastne až do roku 1999. And the problem with the farmers is, right, that when the rain falls on you as a person, that's one thing. But then if farmer, you live off land. So and the radioactivity gets into the land, and potentially you then eat it or digest it somehow, right?
Exactly. So I moved on to the Ministry of Agriculture records to see, what kinds of, what's causing all these health problems, and what kinds of chain of exposure did people encounter. And what happens is exactly as you described, Samuel, that people are farmers, and they're working outside, and they're working in the dust, and they breathe in radioactive dust. Then they go and they grow food, and the food is biomagnifies radioactive isotopes in the soil. They get concentrated in greater levels in the root vegetables and peas and the corn and the cows' bodies that then becomes milk and cheese and butter. I found there was 100,000 cattle that were slaughtered right after the accident because they were so contaminated. The Soviets didn't want to throw that meat away. So they sent out a manual for meat packers, and they told them, take the meat, grade it, high level and low levels of radiation, take the lower levels and mix it together with clean meat and make sausage, send it all over the country except Moscow. And then the really radioactive meat, put in freezers, mix it up, yeah. And the really high level radioactive meat, put in freezers and wait until the radiation decays. So what I found is they ran out of freezers. They took a train car, put 60 tons of high level radioactive meat in the train car, and they sent it to Baku. And they didn't want it in Baku, they sent it to Yerevan. And for 4 years, this ghost train circulated the western half of the Soviet Union with radioactive meat that nobody wanted.
Brilliant. If it was a different story, that would have been a brilliant story. It's a sad one, though. Je to taký trošku smutný príbeh, ja vám ho teraz rozpoviem. Kate sa teda vybrala okrem iného na ministerstvo poľnohospodárstva, aby zistila, že aký je ten reťazec problémov, lebo ono to nie je naozaj len tým, že sme my ako ľudia vystavení, dajme tomu dažďu radioaktívnemu. No a zistila, že napríklad teda, že tí farmári, oni jednak dýchajú radioaktívny prach. Potom tie izotopy sa nachádzajú v pôde, ukladajú sa napríklad v koreňovej zelenine, ale samozrejme nachádzajú sa aj v mliečnych produktoch, pretože dobytok spása tú trávu a potom to je v mlieku a je to v syre. Okrem iného to znamenalo aj to, že v Bielorusku bolo usmrtených 100 000 kusov dobytka práve preto, že tá koncentrácia bola taká vysoká. A potom problém bol aj s mäsom, pretože aj to mäso z toho dobytka bolo buď vysoko radioaktívne, alebo nízko radioaktívne. No a ten znelo, že zoberte to nízko radioaktívne mäso, zmiešajte ho s tým čistým mäsom a urobte klobásy. Potom tam bolo ešte to vysoko radioaktívne mäso, ktoré napchali do mrazničiek. A keď sa im minuli mrazničky, tak zobrali vagóny a 60 tón takéhoto vysoko radioaktívneho mäsa poslali najprv do Baku. Lenže v Baku také mäso nechceli, tak ho poslali do Jerevanu. Ale ani tam ho nechceli a takýto vlak potom 4 roky po tej západnej polovici Sovietskeho zväzu udil. No, tak to je neuveriteľný príbeh. Because what's the situation in Belarus, for example, now? Because actually there's very little we know about Belarus as such, right? It's not a very democratic and open country. But the fallout was probably the issues were the biggest over there, right?
Yes, exactly. Belarus received most of the highest percentage of radioactivity from Chernobyl. And what's interesting is I looked everywhere for some kind of count of fatalities, how many people died. Ukrainian government, I found, gives 35,000 women compensation because their husbands died with documented Chernobyl exposures. But that's a really small count. That's just Ukraine, which got the least amount of radioactivity from Chernobyl. It just counts men who died who were old enough to be married. No children, no women are in that count. So off the record, Ukrainian officials say they have about 150,000 dead. Now, Belarus and Russia, far more radiation, have not been brave enough to make a count. We could find no numbers. What I found is that in the years between 1986 and 1996, increasing rates of chronic illnesses, especially among children, especially problems with pregnant women and babies, higher rates of birth defects, infertility problems with children and adults, digestive tract, heart, respiratory system, endocrine system, and autoimmune disorders. Really, you could just see the charts going sky high. And just anecdotally, when I was traveling around southern Belarus, I would pick up hitchhikers because the buses were not working. And every person I picked up just women and children. Everybody was traveling to or from a medical clinic for medical attention. And what they would say down there is, yeah, everybody's got something.
Opýtal som sa na to, že aká je teda situácia v Bielorusku, lebo to nie je úplne najotvorenejšia a najdemokratickejšia krajina na svete a vlastne aj o tom dopade sa veľmi veľa nevie, napriek tomu, že práve tam bol najväčší za tej katastrofy. A teda na Ukrajine oficiálne údaje hovoria o tom, že 35 000 žien dostáva kompenzáciu za to, že teda ich manželi v dôsledku Černobylskej katastrofy zomreli. Ale to sa teda týka iba mužov, pri ktorých to platí oficiálne a zároveň boli už dosť starí na to, aby teda boli ženatí. Hej. Ale off record ten počet sa udáva zhruba, že 150 000 úmrtí sa teda spája s Černobylom. To je na Ukrajine. V Bielorusku a v Rusku, aby som citoval to, čo Kate povedala, chýbala odvaha, aby to spočítali. Ale dá sa to sledovať napríklad na iných údajoch, že od roku 1986 do roku 1996 tam sa dá spozorovať prudký vzostup chronických ochorení, vysoká chorobnosť detí a tehotných žien, samozrejme narodené deti s vrodenými rôznymi poruchami, okrem toho choroby dýchacích ciest a autoimmunné ochorenia. A najlepšia je asi teda osobná skúsenosť, že keďže autobusy nefungovali, tak Kate chodila autom a brala stopárov a každý jeden ten stopár alebo stopárka išli buď do nemocnice, alebo išli z nemocnice. One of the things I would like to know is what is it like being a reporter in a post-Soviet country? Because I really can imagine that even though, I mean, it's been 20 years more or less since the Soviet Union fell apart, it's still not that easy to access information, probably to talk to people. What is it like?
You know, I've been doing this work since the 1990s, I was there when the Soviet Union fell apart as an American working in Moscow. And I wrote my first book in the 1990s. And, you know, what's interesting is that people in especially these rural places, are always happy to talk to a foreigner, especially somebody who speaks their language. They have stories to tell that they feel they've been overlooked. The Ukrainian archives were marvelously open. I could even access the KGB archives there. Belarus was, even though it's a dictatorship, I was able to get a lot of information. We got records down to the county hospital level. Mm-hmm. And in Russia, it was a little bit more difficult. I could not cross that border between Ukraine and Russia because I started this in 2014 when the war started and that border was closed. So I did less research. I just did research in Moscow in the archives, but not on the ground in the Chernobyl territories of Russia. Mm-hmm. And there would have been problems for an American.
Yeah. Opýtal som sa teda na to, aké to je, keď cudzinec ako reportér príde do takejto postsovietskej krajiny, o ktorej teda predstavujem, a myslím si, že sa úplne nemýlim, že nie je úplne najotvorenejšia a tie informácie sa tam nezískavajú najľahšie. Kate má teda tú skúsenosť, že už v 90. rokoch pracovala teda ako Američanka v Moskve a keď potom pracovala napríklad aj na tejto knihe, tak zistila, že tí ľudia na tom vidieku, keď sa stretnú s cudzincom, tak sa rozprávajú veľmi radi. Veľmi radi mu povedia svoj príbeh, pretože majú pocit, že sú ako keby prehliadaní, že nikto sa ich na nič nepýtal. Okrem toho na Ukrajine sa jej dokonca, tam boli tie archívy úplne otvorené, podarilo sa jej dostať do archívov KGB, v Bielorusku, aj napriek tomu, že je to diktatúra, tak až na úroveň teda tých okresných nemocníc. Trošku problém bol v Rusku v súvislosti s tým, že na knihe začala pracovať v roku 2014 a práve vtedy vypukol konflikt medzi Ukrajinou a Ruskom a teda tam na tých hraniciach asi by mala problémy, takže tam robila ten výskum hlavne v Moskve. And there's also a scene in your book where you're in a forest in, I think it's Belarus, the unbelievably radioactive forest, where you've got the dosimeter, is that what it's called? Well, you've got this device to measure radioactivity and it's going crazy because it's just radioactive as probably nothing in the world, right? And you were there. Weren't you scared? That's the first thing that popped up in my mind when I was reading that scene was like, no, I would never, ever in my life go there for no money, for no reason would I go there. Weren't you scared?
Well, you know, when I was following these biologists who have worked in the Chernobyl zone since 2000, and because I wanted to understand more about the ecology of the zone when it's radioactive, when it's contaminated. And so I've been doing that for several years. And so my job was, what I said to myself is, wherever they go, I will go when I'm with them. So one morning we woke up, we're in the little town of Chernobyl, and they say, we're going to the Red Forest. And I was like, oh, boo. Because that's the most radioactive area from Chernobyl. I expected like 50 microsieverts an hour. That's bad. That's pretty high. But you could do it for an hour or two. Mm-hmm. But when I got there, my Geiger counter was going crazy at 1,000 microsieverts an hour. And I asked the biologists, why 20 times more? And they said, oh, there was a fire here last fall, and that took all the radiation that was stored in the leaves and in the trees, and it volatilized it again and made a new nuclear event. And we noticed last summer there was a lot of fires in Ukraine, in the Chernobyl zone too. Each time that happens, people who live nearby, who are in the clouds, get the downs of smoke from those fires, they are exposed as well. We shouldn't be saying that nature is thriving in the Chernobyl zone, nature takes care of itself. We need to carefully curate, watch those spaces and make sure there aren't things like fires going on there.
Mm-hmm. Opýtal som sa na takú zaujímavú scénu, ktorá sa tam odohráva a Kate sa v nej nachádza v takom lese, ktorý je neuveriteľne radioaktívny a teraz ten merač tej radioaktivity jej šialene pípa v ruke a ona tam napriek tomu je. Ja som sa jej opýtal, že či nemala strach, lebo ja by som tam nikdy v živote nešiel. No a ona hovorí, že teda počas výskumu na túto knihu spolupracovala s biológmi, ktorí od roku 2000 tam pracujú okolo Černobylu a sledujú teda aj okrem iného, ako sa mení príroda. No a tí jedného dňa povedali, že ideme do červeného lesa. No tak išla s nimi. A očakávala teda žiarenie niekde na úrovni 50 mikrosievertov za hodinu, čo je také bezpečné, že na 2 hodiny sa tomu človek môže vystaviť. No a keď tam prišla, tak tá miera dosiahla 1000 mikrosievertov za hodinu. A tí biológovia jej vysvetlili, že je to preto, lebo jeseň predtým tam bol veľký požiar, v dôsledku ktorého sa z listov a teda z tých kmeňov a tak všetka tá radioaktivita, ktorá tam bola uložená, sa uvoľnila a bolo to vlastne ako keby ďalšia nejaká nukleárna udalosť, dá sa povedať, ďalší taký rozšírenie toho žiarenia. A ono sa to deje za každým, keď sa takéto požiare vyskytnú niekde v okolí Černobyla a tie sa teda vyskytujú pravidelne a tí ľudia práve preto sú im potom aj opakovane vystavení a je to niečo, s čím by sme teda sa mali zaoberať a voči čomu by sme asi mali teda bojovať. And the people, the survivors of the catastrophe or their relatives, their wives, their husbands, you've talked to many of them. Some of them, when I read the book, they seemed like I thought, okay, these are true heroes. What are they like? Are they sad, angry, depressed? Are they Zen?
Yeah, I found there are 2 different kinds of people in the Chernobyl contaminated lands where people were living and farming. There are the people who learned what was going on. They made alliances with doctors and radiation monitors. And even though the Soviet government was telling them nothing, they found out, how much radiation was in their areas. And they wrote letters to the government and said, look, we have this, our town is okay, but the schoolyard is really radioactive and our kids play there. You need to pave the schoolyard and everything will be fine. So they came up with practical solutions for the problem. They didn't panic. They didn't become hysterical. Other people, and when I met those people, they were positive, active people. They were people who take control of their lives. They seemed good. Other people were more fatalistic. They stayed in the Chernobyl zone. They didn't really want to know much about how bad it was or what the consequences were for their own lives. And those people seemed depressed, angry. They didn't like 30 years later to be stigmatized as some kind of radioactive mutants. And they had a lot of health problems.
So they were more like, okay, this happened, it's over, let's not, talk about it ever again, right?
Yeah.
Ešte vám pripomeniem, že ak máte, preložím túto odpoveď za chvíľku, ale pripomeniem vám, že ak vy máte nejaké otázky, tak kľudne ich píšte pod toto video. My sa ešte budeme s Kate rozprávať asi 20 minút, potom na ne dám priestor. No a teraz otázka, ktorú som položil, bola teda taká, že tam je veľmi veľa takých tých bežných ľudských osudov, pri ktorých ja som si povedal, že toto sú tí hrdovia. A opýtal som sa, že tí preživší, či už manželky alebo manželia tých, ktorí tam napríklad zahynuli pri tom zásahu, že akú majú náladu, že či majú depresiu, alebo sú nahnevaní, alebo ako. No oni sa delia na dve skupiny. Jedna skupina je tá, ktorí sú ľudia, ktorí vedeli, čo sa stalo, mali spojenie s lekármi alebo s ľuďmi priamo na tom mieste, a zistili teda, čo sa stalo, aké hodnoty sa namerali a tak ďalej. A práve oni potom písali listy, napríklad vláde písali, že tu je školský dvor, naše deti sa na ňom hrajú a tento školský dvor, tam tá radiácia je naozaj vysoká, my musíme s tým niečo robiť a ponúkali praktické riešenia, hľadali ich. A títo ľudia aj dnes sú takí, že pozitívni a sú aktívni. A potom je tam tá druhá skupina, to sú tí fatalisti. To sú veľmi často ľudia teda na tom vidieku, ktorí žijú z tej pôdy, ktorí to všetko zažili, prežili, nechcú o tom hovoriť, nechcú o tom vedieť. Navonok sa prejavujú tak veľmi nahnevane a ako keby depresívne, no a samozrejme majú veľmi veľké zdravotné problémy. What was for you when you were doing your research for the book? What was the most, frightening moment, or maybe the most, emotional moment? Because it's a very emotional, you're a scientist, right? We're mostly talking about science or, about mechanisms, but in the end, this is a very emotional topic, right? So what was the most emotional situation for you?
Well, I think coming across documents that nobody had ever, I was the first one to see them, first one to check them out of the archives, and seeing the picture of kind of on a wide scale, whole communities where 80 to 90% of the children have one chronic disease or another. Adults are suffering from chronic illnesses and cancers are starting to come. And just, it was so sad to think of how people struggled that way. So that I just reading, I would get sort of depressed and emotional. But then, I met people, I sought out these sort of everyday heroes you were talking about. And one woman, she was a physicist and she had figured out so many things just by working from her little courtyard in Kiev and extrapolating. She figured out what had happened at the accident, what happened at the site, the nuclear power site, what had exploded. And she went and warned people. She tried to warn Western scientists at an international conference in Kiev, and the CIA, the KGB grabbed her and pulled her out. And so when I met her,
as a cleaning lady, right?
Dressed as a cleaning lady, yeah. And so when I met her, she'd written many letters to her government to inform them, and nobody had ever answered her. And finally, 30 years later, I showed up. I answered her letters that were in the archives. And she was so grateful to have somebody finally hear her that she gave me a Ukrainian embroidered shirt.
The white
and I was very touched.
Right.
Exactly. I was, yes, in the Ukrainian colors.
Yeah.
And I was very touched by that. Natalia Lazitska is her name.
Yeah. Opýtal som sa na taký možno najsilnejší moment počas získavania materiálu na túto knihu. A Kate hovorí teda, že ona našla veľké množstvo dokumentov, ktoré predtým nikto buď nehľadal, alebo ich nenašiel, a bolo pre ňu veľmi smutné, keď teda videla, že napríklad 80 alebo 90% detí v nejakej oblasti trpí chronickými chorobami a takisto dospelí trpia chronickými chorobami. Ale potom je tam veľmi špecifický príklad jednej lekárky v Kieve, o ktorej teda hovoríme, že je to hrdinka, Pretože táto lekárka v Kieve iba na základe nejakých informácií, ktoré nejako pozískavala, odkiaľ sa dalo, vydedukovala, že čo sa stalo, čo vybuchlo, ako to prebehlo a čo z toho vyplýva. A snažila sa varovať ľudí, snažila sa varovať vedcov, západných vedcov. Tam v tej knihe je scéna, kde ona počas takejto konferencie dokonca sa vkradne do budovy prezlečená za upratovačku, aby sa k tým západným vedcom dostala. Vtedy ju zhrabne KGB a nasadia ju na autobus a ide domov. Písala listy vláde, aby ich upozornila na to nebezpečenstvo a nikto jej neodpovedal. Až teda po 10 ročiach prišla Kate a na tie listy, ktoré v tom archíve našla, jej konečne odpovedala. A tá lekárka, Natália Lazická, ona bola taká vďačná, že teda darovala potom Kate takéto tradičnú košelu ukrajinsku s ukrajinskými farbami, tak to bol taký veľmi silný moment. You've mentioned the scientists, and that's one of the issues, I mean, that you're dealing with, and probably the world is still dealing with as well. I mean, it's because normally we accept that, okay, the Soviets didn't really tell anyone what was happening. They didn't even, admit it to themselves. They didn't really. But what you're saying is that also, I mean, the Western world, they were not the heroes of the peace as well, right? Why is that?
Yeah, unfortunately. Well, in 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and UN agencies took over assessing Chernobyl consequences. And the UN agency that took the lead was the International Atomic Energy Agency, which was created by the Americans in the 1960s as a lobby for nuclear power and all kinds of peaceful, productive uses of nuclear energy. So the International Atomic Energy Agency sent in scientists in 1990, and they did a study over a year, and they came away saying, we don't see any health problems. We don't expect to see any but a few extra cancers among children for thyroid. There's no problem here. And just at that time, the UN had a pledge drive to raise money, about $1 billion in today's money, to do two things. The first was to move those 200,000 people who lived in Mogilev from radioactive territory. And the second thing was to do a long-term health study on what happens to humans living with chronic low doses of radiation. The only other big nuclear study on human health was the Hiroshima studies in Japan. Those were studies of what happens when you're blown up for less than a second by rays from a nuclear bomb. But Chernobyl is very different. So the International Atomic Energy Agency scientists were very nervous because at that time, archives were opening in the West that showed the record of the Americans and the French and the British and the Soviets testing and producing nuclear weapons. Mm-hmm. And those blowing up over 400 nuclear bombs over the decades of the Cold War into the atmosphere produced far, far, far more radioactive fallout than Chernobyl. So just take Chernobyl issued 45 million curies of radioactive iodine that causes thyroid cancers and problems. Just nuclear testing by the Soviets, by the Americans at one test ground in Nevada produced 150 billion curies of radioactive iodine. That you see the difference. Mm-hmm. And so they were worried. But if you could say only 33 people died from Chernobyl, and that was the world's worst nuclear accident, then all those lawsuits over testing nuclear weapons could just go away. And that's indeed what happened.
Opýtal som sa na to, že spomenuli sme už tých západných vedcov a Kate v knihe hovorí, že tí západní vedci sa teda tiež úplne nezachovali ako hrdinové, alebo to, že Sovietský zväz nepriznal, čo sa stalo, to všetci vieme, ale že teda ten západný svet sa k tomu tiež nepostavil úplne ideálne a že prečo. No a odpoveď je taká, že v roku 1991 Sovietský zväz sa teda rozpadol a vtedy ako keby zavládol taký pomerne veľký strach, pretože samozrejme existuje Medzinárodná organizácia pre atomovú energiu, kde pomerne veľký vplyv majú rôzni americkí lobisti, je to aj taká, dá sa povedať, že organizácia. A vtedy po páde Sovietskeho zväzu prebehla jednoročná štúdia tých dopadov Černobylu, tej katastrofy, so záverom, že žiadne nejaké zásadné problémy, už vôbec nie masové, v zásade neexistujú. Lenže potom teda Organizácia spojených národov získala $1 miliardu, ktorej cieľom boli dve veci. Jednak vysťahovať tých 200 000 ľudí žijúcich stále v oblasti toho Mogileva, ktorých som spomínali, a potom urobiť dlhotrvajúcu štúdiu, aký vplyv má dlhodobé vystavenie nízkej dávke radioaktivity. Pretože v podstate v tomto bol Černobyl jeden veľmi veľký test, lebo druhý test, ktorý prebehol, bol akurát tak v Hirošime, ale ten je trochu iný, lebo tam teda to je, že vysoká dávka radioaktivity za 1 sekundu a ten Černobyl je naopak. No a práve preto tí vedci z Medzinárodnej organizácie pre atomovú energiu boli nervózni, týkalo sa to totižto Američanov, týkalo sa to Francúzov, Britov a Rusov, pretože keď sa tie všetky archívy otvorili, tak vlastne vychádzalo najavo, že ako masovo oni produkovali atomové zbrane a ako masovo ich testovali. Že vlastne do atmosféry bol vypustený ekvivalent 400 teda atomových bomb, a to je samozrejme o mnoho viac ako Černobyl. Máme tu aj porovnanie, teraz ho vidíte na obrazovke. Pri výbuchu Černobylu teda došlo k uvoľneniu 45 miliónov kariov a iba na jednom teda testovacom mieste, tak to poviem, jednom konkrétnom v Nevade, počas tých testov počas studenej vojny bolo uvoľnených až 150 miliárd, a to dobre čítate, naozaj je to 150 miliárd kariov, takže proporčne je to úplne iné číslo. Is that also the reason why I've read a few reviews of the book, and some of them say, it's a controversial book. It's not quite right. It doesn't fit, sometimes they say, I'm not saying they're right. I'm saying what they say is, oh, she's only picking, cherry picking things that suit her narrative. Is that because they are all, some of them, either funded by the lobby or they have some interests themselves, or is it so hard for them to accept the truth, or why is that?
Well, the main critics are two people. One is a sort of a radio ecologist who's a physicist, and the other one is a sort of a pro-nuclear environmentalist who has a couple of pro-nuclear environmentalist. He's also anti-renewables. So the first one, the scientist, does get money from the European atomic energy funds. And he's sort of an outlier among a radio ecologist who still says that the Chernobyl zone is thriving. And most of the radio ecologists now, most of the biologists agree that that there are some big animals there, but that their lives are shorter, that in areas where there's high levels of radiation, it's hard to find even little mice and voles and birds. So there's that controversy, but the people who mostly criticize me are those who are people who receive funds from the nuclear industry. And as I document in my book, they were very good at attacking any kind of scientist who disagreed with them. And they use, slander, discrediting people, saying that they do things like cherry pick. But my study was to look at what the Soviets were saying and finding on the ground in the first 5 years after the accident. And that those are the records I used. I didn't cherry pick from them. I just used those. And they're complaining that I didn't use their studies that came later, which I show working through the UN archives, that they're sort of doctoring those reports. They're throwing out the Soviet studies. They're hiding children's biopsies. they're doing some things that are, pretty disreputable.
Not very scientific and not very fair.
Yeah.
Prečítal som si niektoré recenzie knihy a niektoré teda hovorili, že je to taká kontroverzná kniha, že Kate si tak vyberá nejaké fakty, ktoré zahrnie a iné nezahrnie podľa toho, ako jej to sedí do toho narratívu. Tak som sa opýtal, že či to je teda pravda. Tí ľudia, ktorí to píšu, teda sú, jeden z nich je proatómový environmentalista, to je veľmi zaujímavá kombinácia. A druhý napríklad je teda vedec, ktorý berie peniaze, a nie je to žiadne tajomstvo, že teda berie peniaze okrem iného aj z teda európskych zdrojov na atomovú energiu. A je to človek, ktorý okrem iného tvrdí, že tá černobylská zóna, že prekvitá, čiže on je až taký, že veľmi extrémny výčnelok, dá sa povedať, lebo konsenzus teda vedecký napriek všetkému je, že sa tam nachádzajú napríklad veľké zvieratá a že aj tie zvieratá, aj tí ľudia naozaj žijú kratšie, že v tomto nie je sporu. A čo sa týka teda nejakého vyberania si toho, čo Kate vyhovovalo, tak ona išla do archívov, do sovietských archívov, zamerala sa na to, čo samotní Sovieti nachádzali počas tých 5 rokov po katastrofe a v podstate to iba interpretovala, vychádzala z tých oficiálnych záznamov, ktoré boli k dispozícii, na rozdiel od jej kritikov, pretože, ako hovorí, tak tí kritici veľmi často si upravujú správy alebo skrývajú nejaké výsledky pitiev detských obetí a celkovo to upravujú tak, aby to vyhovalo ich narratívu. Because the thing is, the Soviet Union was a dictatorship. That's why we didn't get to know, for example, about what happened. And the people in the Soviet Union didn't get to know what happened. But, it's a provocative thought, because if it was a dictatorship, it was also very effective in, mobilizing people, sending them over there. A dictatorship generally make people obey. They tell them, you go there, and the people go there, right? So in the end, dealing with the catastrophe, wasn't it a good thing that it actually happened in a dictatorship?
Probably. It's a little, Japan has had trouble dealing with the accident. They've had the same kinds of problems with lack of transparency. They didn't tell anybody that their reactors melted down for 2 months, not 3 days. And they had 3 reactors melt down, not just one. They pay people extra, poor people extra wages to go in and be jumpers to work on the cleanup, people who have few choices. And we find the Soviets did a really similar thing. Most of the soldiers they sent in were from Central Asia. They were non-Slavs. So we see similar, doesn't necessarily matter if it's capitalist or socialist, we see similar things going on. We see lots of denials from the Japanese government and the Japanese corporation TEPCO, just like the Soviet denials. So what the Soviets did well, though, I think, was zone off the territory, carry out a lot of medical exams. And one of the uses of a closed society is they can do science without worrying that it will get leaked to an open press. So they felt like nobody will ever see these studies, so let's carry them out. Where what I find in the West, and all around the American radioactive zones, they never even asked these questions. They never did any studies. What happens when we blow up bombs over in the American heartland?
Yeah.
What kind of effect will that be? They never asked, because I asked one scientist why, and he said, what if we find something? So I think that's the most useful thing about the Soviet studies, is there are a lot of scientists and doctors on the ground asking important questions, and they stowed those away in classified archives that are now available to the public.
Opýtal som sa otázku, že samozrejme Sovietský zväz bol diktatúra a preto aj samotní občania, alebo ani my tu na Slovensku sme sa nedozvedeli včas o tom, čo sa deje v Černobyle, že či náhodou pri organizácii potom toho zásahu, tej záchrannej akcie nebolo naopak dobre, že že sa to odohralo v diktatúre, ktorá ľuďom dokáže povedať, že čo majú robiť a dokáže ich zorganizovať. No, Kate hovorí, že takéto popieranie toho, čo sa deje, je v zásade charakteristické pri všetkých takýchto udalostiach, lebo aj vo Fukushime teda Japonci nepriznali celý rozsah problému, teda konkrétne bol taký, že nie jeden reaktor a na niekoľko dní ako v Černobyle, ale 3 reaktory a 3 mesiace im tam horeli a takisto ako Sovieti tam posielali ľudí, ktorí nemali veľmi na výber. Tí Japonci v tomto prípade ľudí bez práce, ľudí veľmi chudobných, aby nejako vyriešili tú katastrofu. V prípade Černobylu to bolo tak, že tam prišli vojaci, ale neboli to Slovania, boli to vojaci zo Strednej Ázie. A ak existuje nejaká výhoda, ktorú vôbec teda to, že sa to odohralo v diktatúre, ak existuje nejaká výhoda, ktorá z toho vyplýva, tak je to tá, že vedci sa mohli venovať vede bez obavy z toho, že sa to potom dostane do novín alebo jednoducho na verejnosť. A to je napríklad pomerne veľká výhoda z toho vedeckého pohľadu v porovnaní s USA. Pretože v USA sa takéto štúdie nikdy nerobili na tých napríklad teda testovacích miestach. Nerobili sa okrem iného aj preto, lebo teda keď sa Kate opýtala jedného takéhoto vedca, že prečo sa to nerobí, no tak on povedal, no a čo keby sme tam niečo našli? Hej? Takže to bola vlastne taká výhoda toho, že sa to odohralo v Sovietskom zväze. Do you think it's something that contributed to the ultimate downfall of the Soviet Union?
Oh, sure. They spent a lot of money trying to clean up that accident, trying to close the Chernobyl chapter. And, the Soviets were, they known to have not a great consumer society and not a lot of open politics, but they were very proud of their science and technology. They were the Sputnik nation. And so when this new technology, nuclear reactor, they lost control of it and it blew up. And then when they found to be lied to their public that they everything was safe when everything was not safe, that's when things went off the rails in the Soviet Union. It was really the June of 1989, they published the first radiation maps. And people learned that for 3 years, they'd been living in highly radioactive contaminated territories and nobody had told them. That is when the protests really began and abandoned and they lost control of their country.
Opýtal som sa takú otázku, že či ten Černobyl nejakým spôsobom prispel k rozpadu Sovietskeho zväzu. No situácia bola samozrejme taká, že samozrejme po tej finančnej stránke celé to vysporiadanie sa s tou katastrofou stálo veľmi veľa peniazí. Ale to by nebol až taký problém, lebo teda sovietská spoločnosť nebola veľmi konzumná a okrem iného nebola ani veľmi nejak ako keby otvorená. Ale obyvatelia Sovietskeho zväzu boli veľmi hrdí na svojich vedcov a na technológie. Keď doslova povedala teda, že to bolo, že Sputnik Nation, hej, že tí, ktorí vypustili ten Sputnik do vesmíru. No a v tomto prípade zistili, že tá ich veda a tá ich technológia zlyhala. A okrem toho, že zlyhala, takže tí predstavitelia najvyšší im okrem iného ešte aj, že klamali. A potom prvá správa s mapami toho zamorenia vyšla na verejnosť, sa dostala v júni 1989. A vtedy ľudia zistili, že vlastne mnohí z nich 3 roky žili v zamorených oblastiach bez toho, aby o tom vedeli. A to bol vlastne taký prvý krok k tomu, že zvnútra ako keby už naozaj narastla obrovská nespokojnosť a nakoniec teda tá sovietská diktatúra stratila kontrolu nad krajinou. I'm probably going to ask one of the questions from our viewers. And what about the American people who read it? I think, okay, they might not, take it as personally as we do over here in Slovakia, the Chernobyl catastrophe, but I think even the American readership might be aware of what happened, right? What was their reaction?
Well, I expected to get in a lot of trouble from this book. I'm calling Western scientists and UN agencies are less than honest. I'm I specifically name, and I didn't want to just say, generic scientists. I wanted to name people who are then responsible for their actions and have to answer for it. I worried about lawsuits, but I haven't had any of that. I very carefully documented this story. There's 70 pages of footnotes. You can read the original records if you doubt it. And so, there's the book has won many prizes in the United States and Great Britain. Mm-hmm. And I've had a lot of people write me who became interested, especially young people, after they saw the HBO show. And then they wanted to know, well, what really happened, and so they start to read. So the reception of the book has been mostly positive.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Besides the organization and the scientists, right?
Yeah, well, the nuclear engineering department at MIT, they don't like me.
Okay. Do you meet them often?
I try not to.
Okay, so then that's fine. Opýtal som sa na reakciu, ktorá nasledovala po vydaní knihy. A Kate očakávala teda, že zo strany tej vedeckej komunity a zo strany organizácií príde nejaká teda nesúhlasná reakcia, ale nechcela iba tak genericky povedať, že vedci neurobili toto, čo mali, alebo nejaké organizácie neurobili toto, čo mali. Ona ich tam naozaj menuje a hovorí, kto konkrétne je za čo zodpovedný. Okrem iného čakala súdne žaloby, tie takisto neprišli a možno neprišli aj preto, lebo naozaj veľmi starostlivo tam dáva zdroje, je tam viac ako 70 strán rôznych odkazov na rôzne dokumenty, kto chce, môže si tie záznamy prečítať pokojne v origináli. A teda čo sa týka čitateľov ako takých, tak mnohí z nich si práve pozreli seriál a potom chceli vedieť, že čo sa naozaj stalo, tak prišli, dostali sa takto k jej knihe. A tá reakcia od nich, tá bola prevažne teda pozitívna. Jej kolegovia z MIT, ktorí teda pracujú na oddelení, is it the Atomic Energy Department?
Nuclear Engineering.
Nuclear Engineering, OK. Tak jej kolegovia z oddelenia atomového inžinierstva na MIT, tak tí z knihy neboli nadšení, ale ako som sa spýtal, stretávajú sa často. Takže je to v poriadku. So, I mean, whose fault was it? Because there are several options, right? There are the scapegoats who they were scapegoated. They're okay. They were sentenced. That's one option. The other option was it was like the power plant was not built properly, so it's like I don't know, a fault of whoever built it, whoever designed it. And the third option is Chernobyl happened because the Soviet system as such was wrong, was built on the wrong foundations, whatever, didn't work. That's why Chernobyl happened. So which one of those is true? Or maybe another one?
Yeah. Well, nuclear power is a more dangerous form of energy for humans. And we see this as temperatures warm and flood levels go higher. Most nuclear reactors are on bodies of water. Mm-hmm. And so flooding reactors, flooding of radioactive waste that's stored on shores is a danger that we all face. We have to worry about earthquakes. They built a lot of these reactors before they had knowledge of seismology, before they knew where the fault lines were. And we have to worry about more violent storms that come with climate change too. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So nuclear energy is probably not a good idea for a radically changing climate. So that's one, but that wasn't the Chernobyl problem. The Chernobyl problem was that this reactor was designed, as most reactors are, for military applications. Mm-hmm, this reactor was designed to produce plutonium, which is at the core of nuclear weapons. It's very good at doing that, but it was an unstable reactor and it had some major design flaws, which the Soviets knew about. But because the nuclear department was lived in great secrecy, nobody knew about it. So when they had an accident, a similar kind of accident in 1975 in Leningrad, they changed their manual for operating the operator's manual, but they didn't really tell people, if you do this, the reactor will blow up like a bomb. Mm-hmm, and so that was a problem of Soviet Soviet problems with transparency. But I would argue that, you know, the nuclear regimes in many countries live under a cloak of secrecy, even if it has to do with civilian power.
OK. Položil som takú zásadnú otázku, že koho je to teda chyba. Či to je chyba tých ľudí, ktorí za to odsúdili, alebo je to chyba, dajme tomu, nejaká konštrukčná, alebo je to chyba sovietskeho systému ako takého, ktorý svojou povahou viedol k Černobylu. No, atomová energia ako taká je nebezpečná. Je nebezpečná vtedy, ak napríklad vstúpa teplota, alebo ak sa nachádza blízko nejakej vodnej plochy, pretože môže dojsť k zatopeniu reaktora. Ale takisto hrozbou sú vytrasenia. Mnohé jadrové reaktory alebo elektrárne boli postavené predtým, ako naše vedomosti seizmológii boli dostatočné na to, aby sme vedeli, kadiaľ idú tie praskliny v zemskej kôry. Takže to je nebezpečné takisto. A ďalšie nebezpečenstvo sú teda čoraz prudšie výkyvy počasia alebo búrky, ktoré súvisia s klimatickou zmenou. Čiže v situácii, kedy sa klíma mení, je atomová energia úplne tou najlepšou voľbou. Ale čo sa týka Černobylu ako takého, tak tá elektráreň bola v prvom rade určená na vojenské použitie, na výrobu plutónia. A z princípu teda tá elektráreň mala nejaké stavebné chyby. A Sovieti o tých stavebných chybách vedeli. A dokonca tam aj dochádzalo ku iným nehodám, napríklad v roku 1975 v Leningrade. A v dôsledku toho oni zmenili operačný manuál. Ale tam nenapísali, že ak urobíte toto, tak toto sa stane. Jednoducho neriešili ten úplný problém, ktorý tam vyvstal. Takže v konečnom dôsledku samozrejme je to problém s transparentnosťou toho režimu, ktorá teda tam nejako neprekvitala, ale asi aj so samotnou povahou atomovej energie. OK, we've got minutes left to go, and I've got 2 questions. Are we going to make it? I'll start with the easier one. What do you think about Chernobyl tourism?
Well, I wouldn't recommend going unless you have work there. You know, you really have to go. Lots of people go. 100,000 people were there this year. When I see the tourists, they tend to be young men from all over the world, and it's kind of it's a little bit of a macho journey. I understand the draw, but it's, you know, what I think would be more interesting is to engage in tourism outside the zone, to go meet the people who live in these areas that are still populated. I went berry picking in northern Ukraine, and then I sold my berries to the buyers on the street, and the buyers bring it to the warehouse, and at the warehouse, all the berries are measured for radiation, and all the berries were radioactive. And then they take those berries, there's a permissible level, and they buy the ones over, the ones that are, you know, radioactive, just like the sausage. They mix the clean ones, the cleaner ones with the dirty ones. They get to the European norm, and then they sell them into the European Union. So you all are eating Chernobyl berries. They also go to American markets. It would be better for tourism to go pay, for tourists to go pay to pick those berries and then deposit those berries as radioactive waste. I think we could have a better form of ecotourism that made this world, you know, didn't sort of exploit the tragedy, but tried to make it the world better, clean this place up.
Yeah. Opýtal som sa teda, čo si myslí o tom černobylskom turizme. Kate hovorí, že proti tomu, že čo tých ľudí priťahuje. Minulý rok tam bolo 100,000, ktorí sa tam boli pozrieť, väčšinou teda mladí muži. Jej odporúčanie znie, že ak tam nemáte prácu, tak tam nechoďte. O mnoho viac sa napríklad oplatí navštíviť tie oblasti, ktoré Černobylom boli zasiahnuté a kde stále žijú ľudí, ktorí to mali zažité a ktorí majú o čom hovoriť, ako to samotné miesto. A jedna z vecí, ktorá sa dá urobiť, napríklad to, že niekde na severe Ukrajiny zbierala lesné plody a tie lesné plody potom predala ľuďom, ktorí ich odniesli do továrne. A v tej továrni merajú ich radioaktivitu A oni sú stále radioaktívne. Tak robia s nimi to, že tie radioaktívne plody zmiešajú s tými, ktoré sú zdravé, a tak, aby sa dostali na priemer, ktorý povoluje Európska únia, a takto zmiešané ich potom do Európskej únie posielajú napríklad. Tak tu máme praktické poučenie, že čo jeme. A teda jedna z vecí, ktorá sa dá urobiť, keď už veľmi chcete pomôcť Černobylu a chcete tam ísť, je napríklad zbierať tieto vody a potom sa ich jednoducho zbaviť, aby sa nedostávali medzi tie, ktoré sú zdravé. A celkovo, že teda existuje množstvo spôsobov, ako tento environmentálny turizmus podporiť viac a inak ako tým, že tam pôjdete. OK, the very last question, and it's a yes or no question, but I mean, you'll probably want to say something more, but it's a yes or no question. Atomic energy, yes or no?
I'd say no.
For
reason,
peaceful use, right? For peace, not bombs.
For peaceful, yes, yeah. I mean, it's first of all, it's too expensive. Over and over again, you know, the big companies, American companies and French companies that used to build reactors, they've gotten out of the business. The only countries now are Russia and China building reactors. It's more expensive energy per watt than solar or wind power. You could put up solar panels on top of this building where I'm sitting by this end of the week. It'll take you 20 years to build a nuclear reactor. It just doesn't make sense. It doesn't solve our immediate problems to get rid of CO2, and it doesn't solve any economic issues. And we don't yet know what to do with radioactive waste.
Mm-hmm.
So
Položil som na záver otázku, atomová energia áno alebo nie. A odpoveď, ktorý nám dáva Kate ako odborníčka, ako autorka knihy o Černobyle, hovorí, že nie, pretože atomová energia je drahá, že firmy, ktoré atomové elektrárne stavali z Ameriky a z Francúzska, ich už stavať prestali a teraz sa tomu venujú iba Rusko a Čína. A že jednoducho tá atomová energia je, keď si pozriete, že koľko stojí výroba 1 vatu energie, že to je drahé a oveľa drahšie ako solárna energia alebo ako veterná energia, a je to komplikované. Lebo teda, že solárne panely ona si môže do konca týždňa nainštalovať na streche, ak sa rozhodne, ale postaviť atomovú elektráreň trvá napríklad že 20 rokov. A spôsobuje to mnoho problémov, lebo je tam produkcia CO2 napríklad, nejako veľmi to nepomáha tej ekológii a, čo je takisto dôležité, stále nevieme, ako sa vysporiadať potom s tým atomovým odpadom, ktorý to produkuje. OK. Thank you so much. It's been very, very interesting. I think we've also covered a lot of things that our viewers here in Slovakia have not heard about or thought about. I hope you enjoyed it as well. I did enjoy it immensely. So thank you so much. Thank you for writing.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Samuel, for your hour.
Are we supposed to expect something else from you? I mean, literature-wise.
Well, I've written a couple other books that have not been translated into Slovakian. And the next book I'm writing is about people who communicate with plants. So stay tuned for that.
OK. Dobre. Poďakoval som sa, Kate, za veľmi príjemnú hodinu aj 5 minút, ktoré sme spolu strávili. Verím, že sme sa rozprávali o veciach, ktoré vás zaujímali, o veciach, o ktorých ste možno ani nerozmýšľali, alebo ste o nich nevedeli. A na záver som sa opýtal, že či sa po literárnej máme na niečo tešiť od nej. A teda odpoveď znie, že pracuje na knihe o ľuďoch, ktorí sa rozprávajú s rastlinami. Tak máme sa na čo tešiť. Verím, že potom si ju opäť v slovenskom preklade prečítame. Zatiaľ teda sme sa rozprávali o knihe, ktorú napísala o Černobyle. Tá kniha sa volá Černobyl, príručka prežitia. Autorka sa volala Kate Brown. Ja jej ďakujem veľmi pekne. A moje meno bolo, stále je, Samom Marec. Ja som sa snažil klásť zaujímavé otázky a potom to tlmočiť. Kate, thank you again so much. It's been great. And I do hope to talk to you again after your next book is published and translated.
Thank you very much, Samuel. Ďakujem.
Ďakujem, Maja.
Bye-bye.
Bye.